Shadows over the world. Cold War dawned in the aftermath of a war that had scorched the globe. A new conflict was quietly taking shape. The guns of World War I fell silent, leaving cities in ruins, economies in collapse, and millions of souls displaced. Yet, beneath this fragile calm, the seeds of a different kind of war were sown not with tanks and bombs, but with suspicion, ideology, and the looming threat of annihilation. This was the Cold War, a frozen battlefield stretching across continents, oceans, and even the skies above. The United States emerged from the Second World War as a colossus of industry and innovation, its cities largely untouched by enemy fire, its population hardened yet hopeful. Across the vast expanse of Eurasia, the Soviet Union rose from its own crucible of fire, having endured a staggering human toll, but possessing an iron grip over its territories and a formidable arsenal of manpower. For decades, the two superpowers would face off not on conventional battlefields, but in shadowy corridors of diplomacy, in nuclear laboratories, in proxy wars fought in distant lands, and in the silent war of espionage and propaganda. Yet there was another player, often underestimated, often dismissed: China. The sprawling, ancient civilization had been torn apart by decades of civil war, foreign invasions, and internal strife. But under the enigmatic figure of Mao Zedong, China began to emerge from the shadows, its communist ideology sharpened by years of struggle, its people mobilized under promises of equality, power, and destiny. Mao was no mere revolutionary, he was a strategist, a visionary, who saw not only the immediate battles but the long chess game of global influence. The ideological map of the world was far from simple. This was not a tale of East versus West neatly divided by oceans and borders. Mao's China did not always march in step with Moscow, nor did it see the United States as merely a distant threat. The world was a fluid landscape of shifting allegiances, secret agreements, and unseen forces. Decisions made in Beijing could ripple across the Pacific, prompting responses in Washington or whispers in the Kremlin. As early as 1949, when the People's Republic of China was officially proclaimed, the world began to recognize that a new balance of power was emerging. The United States watched with wary eyes as this vast nation of nearly 1 billion people consolidated under a single communist party. Mao understood the fragility of his rule. The country was rife with internal tensions, war fatigue, and the ever-present specter of famine. Yet in this crucible, he saw opportunity, the chance to assert China as a formidable global actor, not merely a regional player. It was in Korea, a narrow peninsula torn between North and South, where these ambitions first intersected violently with American interests. The invasion of South Korea by communist forces in June 1950 was not just a regional conflict, it was a test of wills, a proving ground for new doctrines of Cold War engagement. Mao, despite the infancy of the People's Republic, committed Chinese forces to this distant struggle, risking both lives and legitimacy to ensure China's voice would be heard on the world stage. The young Chinese soldiers who crossed the Yalu River under cover of night were part of a broader vision, a demonstration that China would not be a passive observer in a world divided by ideology. For the United States, the rapid escalation of the Korean War confirmed the new global reality. The struggle for influence had become truly multipolar. Washington understood that decisions made in Beijing could now reverberate across the Pacific, challenging American dominance and testing the fragile alliances that had been built after the war. The Cold War, as Americans and Soviets would later frame it, was a contest of ideologies, technology, and global reach. But for Mao, it was also intensely personal, a struggle to solidify internal power, inspire the masses, and assert China's place in a world dominated by superpowers. As tension mounted, the stage was set for a series of confrontations that would define the geopolitical landscape for decades to come, shaping the lives of millions and leaving an indelible mark on history. In these early years, the contours of the Cold War were still forming. Nuclear shadows loomed, espionage networks were quietly established, and propaganda campaigns stretched across oceans. The stage was vast, the players formidable, and the stakes existential. This was the beginning of an era where every decision, every movement, every whispered communication could tip the balance between peace and global catastrophe. And at the center of it all, an unlikely actor, Mao Zedong, prepared to reshape the world in ways few in the West or even the Soviet Union could yet comprehend. The Dragon Awakens, Mao's strategies, and the Korean Crucible. By the dawn of the 1950s, the world was a chessboard of tension, a fragile lattice of alliances, ambitions, and ideological divides. In Beijing, Mao Zedong paced the halls of Zhongnanai, the seat of China's fledgling government, contemplating not merely survival, but supremacy. The People's Republic of China was barely a year old, yet it bore the weight of 1 billion souls, a devastated economy, and a landscape scarred by decades of foreign invasions and civil war. The country was fragile, yet Mao's mind was anything but. It was a calculating engine of revolutionary ambition. Mao understood the emerging Cold War not as a binary conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, but as a complex interplay of forces in which China could carve out its own path. While Washington and Moscow framed the ideological battle as a struggle between capitalism and communism, Mao saw opportunity in the gaps, in the cracks between the superpowers' assumptions. In his view, China's power did not rest solely on ideology, it rested on maneuver, discipline, and the loyalty of millions. It was in Korea that these calculations first collided with reality. The invasion of South Korea by the North in June 1950 posed a strategic dilemma. A communist-led state had crossed a border supported by the United States, challenging not only regional stability, but global perception. Mao recognized the stakes immediately. If China failed to intervene, it would risk being perceived as weak, incapable of defending its ideological and territorial interests. But intervention carried immense risks. The United States' military power, technological advantage, and naval supremacy could easily overwhelm China's still recovering forces. The decision was therefore both pragmatic and symbolic. Mao mobilized the People's Volunteer Army, a force drawn largely from veterans of the Civil War and freshly indoctrinated recruits, under the cover of secrecy. These troops crossed the Yalu River under moonless nights, their movements masked by forests and mountains, their presence at first undetected by American intelligence. Mao's strategy was not to confront the Americans head-on with conventional tactics. Instead, he employed a Revolutionary War doctrine, part guerrilla, part mass mobilization, part psychological operation. He sought to leverage China's numerical advantage, the terrain, and the element of surprise to offset technological disparities. The first engagements along the 38th parallel were chaotic, brutal, and unpredictable. The American forces, confident after their rapid push to Pyongyang, were suddenly confronted by waves of determined Chinese troops who vanished into the hills only to re-emerge in unexpected locations. The Korean winter, with temperatures plunging well below freezing, became an ally to the Chinese strategy as soldiers, unprepared for the harsh conditions, found themselves bogged down while the Chinese, acclimated and hardened, pressed forward. The battles of Chosin Reservoir, Triangle Hill, and multiple small, but lethal skirmishes tested the mettle of both armies, revealing both the ferocity of Chinese resolve and the vulnerabilities of American overconfidence. Mao's approach was meticulous. He emphasized strict discipline, political education, and indoctrination within the ranks. Soldiers were expected not merely to fight, but to understand the broader ideological stakes. Each skirmish was framed as a defense of the homeland, an act of global significance, and a demonstration of the communist cause. Letters sent home to families reinforced this narrative, painting the struggle as an essential component of China's rise and survival. Behind the lines, political commissars monitored morale, ensured adherence to Maoist doctrine, and nurtured the sense of collective purpose that would distinguish Chinese forces from their adversaries. The United States, meanwhile, grappled with the sudden escalation. Washington had assumed a limited conflict, a containment operation, not a full-scale intervention against a major communist state. President Harry Truman and his military advisors debated strategy, oscillating between limited engagements and broader offensives. American air power, advanced artillery, and mechanized units initially held the upper hand, but the fluidity and tenacity of Chinese tactics frustrated conventional approaches. For the US, Korea became a cautionary tale of underestimating an emergent power and the complexities of ideological warfare in a region distant from the Atlantic sphere. Mao's strategy extended beyond mere battlefield maneuvers. He understood that the Cold War was as much a psychological and diplomatic contest as a military one. He used Korea to send signals to the United States, to the Soviet Union, and to domestic audiences that China would not be marginalized, that it was a player on the global stage with the capacity to project power. He calculated the political impact of troop movements, casualty figures, and propaganda carefully, knowing that every loss and every victory would resonate far beyond the battlefield. By late 1950, the Chinese forces had not only halted the American advance, but had pushed troops back across the 38th parallel. This success was monumental. It transformed the perception of China from a passive, war-torn state into an assertive actor capable of challenging the world's foremost military power. Yet victory was incomplete. American technological superiority, the jet fighters, heavy artillery, and logistical support remained a persistent threat. The war became a grinding stalemate, characterized by alternating gains and losses, devastating attrition, and immense human suffering. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers perished, many due to heavy American weaponry, extreme weather, and insufficient supplies. The logistical challenge of moving hundreds of thousands of troops across rugged terrain under constant threat forced Mao to innovate continuously. Supply lines were hardened, local populations mobilized for support, and improvisation became the watchword of survival. Despite these challenges, Mao's leadership ensured a coherent strategy, blending ideological motivation with tactical flexibility, creating an army capable of enduring conditions that might have broken lesser forces. Within China, the war had profound implications. It solidified Mao's grip on power, reinforcing his cult of personality. Successes on the Korean Peninsula were framed as proof of the superiority of Maoist doctrine and of the inevitability of China's rise. Propaganda campaigns highlighted heroic sacrifices, martyrdom, and the moral righteousness of China's intervention. The Korean War was no longer merely a military engagement, it became a moral and political theater through which the Communist Party could legitimize its rule and galvanize the population. At the same time, the United States recalibrated its Cold War strategy. Korea demonstrated that American global influence could not be assumed and that regional conflicts could rapidly escalate into major confrontations with unpredictable actors. Washington intensified its focus on alliances, security guarantees to nations in Asia, and a broader strategy of containment, which would shape US foreign policy for decades. The psychological impact of Chinese intervention was profound. Policymakers and military strategists in Washington now recognize the importance of understanding emerging powers and the limits of technological dominance without sufficient human and logistical coordination. The Korean War, therefore, became a crucible for the Cold War itself, a testing ground not only of military prowess, but of ideological conviction, political acumen, and strategic vision. Mao's decisions in 19,501,951 were emblematic of his broader approach, a combination of calculated risk, relentless attention to political symbolism, and a profound understanding of the interplay between domestic legitimacy and international perception. Every movement of troops, every declaration, and every propaganda campaign was designed to assert China's agency and redefine the global balance of power. In retrospect, the Korean War was more than a regional conflict. It was a declaration that China, under Mao's leadership, would not be a mere spectator in a world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Mao demonstrated that strategic audacity, ideological discipline, and the mobilization of mass resources could allow a nation to punch far above its apparent weight. The United States learned, at tremendous cost, that emerging powers could disrupt assumptions, reshape strategies, and challenge dominance in ways that conventional military theory often failed to anticipate. As the first artillery shells fell on the Korean Peninsula and the Yalu River became a corridor of life, death, and ideology, the Cold War was no longer just a distant abstraction. It had become a visceral, brutal, and personal conflict, and Mao Zedong had positioned China at its center. The battles, the calculations, and the human sacrifices of Korea were the crucible in which the modern Chinese state and its global ambitions were forged. For Mao, the Korean War was both a challenge and an opportunity, a moment to define China's role in a world where power, perception, and ideology were inseparably intertwined. Shadows of Korea consolidation and the dragons reached the Korean Peninsula fell into a fragile silence after the armistice of July 1953. Yet the echoes of war reverberated far beyond the 38th parallel. For Mao Zedong, the conclusion of active hostilities did not signal retreat or complacency. It marked the beginning of a new phase of strategic calculation. China had demonstrated that it could project power beyond its borders, defend its ideological allies, and challenge the United States directly. But victory in Korea had come at a tremendous cost. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers dead or wounded, cities strained under supply demands, and the fledgling nation struggling to absorb the human and economic toll. Mao's consolidation of power within China intensified in the wake of Korea. The People's Republic was still only a few years old, yet the Korean War had elevated Mao from revolutionary leader to undisputed paramount authority. He leveraged the war to fortify the party's political legitimacy, portraying the Chinese intervention as both a defensive necessity and a moral triumph over imperialist aggression. The cult of personality surrounding him deepened, woven through education, propaganda, and cultural campaigns that celebrated the sacrifices of Chinese soldiers and the wisdom of the chairman. Internally, the post-Korean period saw a deliberate reshaping of Chinese society to align with Maoist principles. Land reform campaigns, collectivization of agriculture, and industrialization projects accelerated under the guise of national recovery and modernization. The party's reach extended into villages and cities alike, embedding ideological loyalty at every level. Mao's strategy was clear: a China unified under his vision, resilient against foreign threats, and capable of asserting influence beyond its borders. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies assessed the lessons of Korea with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The armistice had preserved South Korea, but the strategic shock of Chinese intervention was indelible. Washington recognized that containment in Asia required nuanced understanding of local politics, the limits of military force, and the ambitions of emerging powers. Korea had demonstrated that regional conflicts could escalate rapidly, drawing in great powers with global implications. The US shifted its approach, strengthening alliances through SEATO and increasing military and economic support to vulnerable nations, seeking to prevent similar surprises in the future. China's gaze soon turned south, toward Vietnam, where colonial legacies and ideological battles intersected with global Cold War tensions. The First Indochina War had ended with the Geneva Accords of 1954, dividing Vietnam along the 17th parallel into a communist north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and a non-communist south, supported by France and later the United States. Mao observed these developments closely, recognizing both opportunity and risk. Supporting the North Vietnamese offered China the chance to extend influence in Southeast Asia, counter American power, and demonstrate solidarity within the communist world. Yet it also carried the danger of overextension, replicating the logistical challenges faced in Korea. Mao's involvement in Vietnam was strategic and measured. Unlike Korea, where China committed large-scale ground forces, in Vietnam China provided engineering, logistical, and advisory support, alongside limited artillery and training. Over 100,000 Chinese personnel were deployed to construct roads, railways, and fortifications, ensuring that North Vietnam could sustain its military efforts. Mao understood that success in Vietnam required a delicate balance, projecting power without provoking a direct confrontation with the United States, while reinforcing China's ideological influence in the region. The 1960s brought further complexity to the China-Vietnam relationship. Mao's vision for revolutionary expansion often clashed with local realities. He encouraged land reform, mobilization of peasants, and ideological campaigns within North Vietnam. Yet Ho Chi Minh and his generals resisted external prescriptions that interfered with domestic governance. Tensions grew as the North Vietnamese increasingly sought support from the Soviet Union, creating a triangular dynamic of influence and competition between China, the USSR, and Vietnam. For Mao, this was both a challenge to his authority and a reflection of the shifting nature of the Cold War. Alliances were fluid, ideological solidarity was never guaranteed, and regional conflicts could test the limits of China's influence. Simultaneously, Mao's relationship with the United States evolved, oscillating between hostility and cautious engagement. The shadow of Korea lingered over US-Chinese relations, shaping American perceptions of China as a formidable, unpredictable adversary. Mao, for his part, understood that direct confrontation with the United States carried enormous risk. Instead, he sought to employ indirect strategies supporting revolutionary movements, leveraging regional conflicts, and engaging in carefully orchestrated diplomatic gestures to enhance China's global standing without provoking a catastrophic war. One such gesture came in the early 1970s with the unexpected opening of ping-pong diplomacy. While seemingly minor a chance encounter between American table tennis players and their Chinese counterparts, the event was emblematic of Mao's strategic patience. He understood the symbolic power of small, controlled interactions to reshape perceptions, signal openness, and create leverage for larger diplomatic initiatives. It was a calculated step in the broader chess game of Cold War diplomacy, where every move, no matter how subtle, could have significant ramifications. Throughout this period, the interplay between domestic consolidation and international strategy defined Mao's leadership. Internally, he fortified control over the Communist Party, expanded ideological education, and mobilized the population behind economic and social campaigns. Externally, he navigated the complex currents of the Cold War, leveraging conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, managing relations with the Soviet Union, and countering American influence in Asia. Mao's approach was holistic. Military strategy, diplomacy, political ideology, and cultural messaging were interwoven into a comprehensive vision for China's rise. The aftermath of Korea had also transformed China's perception of power projection. Mao recognized that technological inferiority could be offset by human ingenuity, political cohesion, and strategic audacity. He observed the United States' reliance on advanced weaponry and logistical superiority, noting that conventional metrics of power were insufficient predictors of success when faced with a determined, ideologically motivated adversary. Korea had taught him the value of resilience, adaptability, and the careful orchestration of military, political, and psychological tools. By the late 1960s, Mao's China had emerged as a regional power capable of shaping events far beyond its borders. Its involvement in Vietnam demonstrated a nuanced understanding of proxy engagement, balancing influence with restraint. Its relationship with the United States, though still antagonistic, had become more sophisticated, with both sides recognizing the limits of direct confrontation and the potential for strategic dialogue. The Cold War, once dominated by the superpower rivalry of Washington and Moscow, was now a tripartite contest in which Beijing played a decisive, independent role. Ultimately, the aftermath of Korea was not simply a military or political episode, it was a formative crucible in which China's modern approach to international relations was forged. Mao's consolidation of power, his strategies in Vietnam, and his evolving interactions with the United States reflected a leader attuned to the complex interplay of ideology, strategy, and perception. Korea had taught hard lessons, but it had also provided the foundation upon which China would navigate the turbulent waters of the Cold War for decades to come. The dragon opens its door diplomacy, and the rapprochement in the 1970s dawned over a world defined by uncertainty and transformation. The Cold War, once a contest of purely military might, had evolved into a complex matrix of ideology, diplomacy, and influence. For Mao Zedong, China's paramount leader, the decade offered both challenge and opportunity. The People's Republic, now over 2 decades old, had endured war, revolution, and consolidation, yet it remained a nation seeking both respect and security on the global stage. Mao's strategy shifted. Recognizing that ideological purity alone would not suffice, China needed engagement with the outside world, even with its erstwhile adversaries. The seeds of rapprochement were sown in an unlikely arena: sport. Table tennis, a seemingly innocuous pastime, became the conduit for China's first overt diplomatic gestures toward the United States since the Korean War. In April 1971, during the World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, American player Glenn Cowan inadvertently boarded the wrong bus and found himself among the Chinese delegation. The encounter, initially casual and almost accidental, became a media sensation. Chinese champion Zhuang Zedong approached Cowan with a warm smile, sparking a brief but highly publicized exchange. In a world watching every move between East and West, the interaction symbolized a subtle yet powerful message: China was prepared to explore dialogue. Mao understood the strategic potential of such small gestures. To the casual observer, ping-pong diplomacy might appear trivial, a minor sports anecdote, but to the shrewd strategist, it was a window into the dynamics of perception and influence. Mao saw the opportunity to reshape global narratives. China was not merely a distant, hostile power, it was a nation capable of civility, diplomacy, and control over the timing and nature of its interactions. The exchange with Cowan was carefully orchestrated, framed for maximum symbolic impact, and reported widely both within China and internationally. It demonstrated that China could dictate the tempo of engagement while maintaining its ideological stance. The following months were a flurry of planning and preparation. Chinese diplomats, military advisors, and political strategists coordinated behind the scenes, laying the groundwork for a historic opening. Mao's goal was not only to normalize relations with the United States, but also to leverage the rapprochement to counterbalance the Soviet Union. The Sino-Soviet split had grown increasingly pronounced. Moscow's policies diverged from Beijing's revolutionary vision, and tensions along the northern border threatened to erupt at any moment. By engaging with Washington, Mao sought to create a triangular balance. China could assert itself independently, counter Soviet influence, and secure a position of strategic leverage in global affairs. In February 1972, the world watched as President Richard Nixon stepped onto Chinese soil, the first American leader to do so in history. The event was nothing short of monumental, a testament to years of careful maneuvering, strategic patience, and the subtle orchestration of diplomacy. Mao welcomed Nixon at Beijing's Great Hall of the People, a carefully choreographed scene of grandeur and symbolism. Photographs captured the moment, Mao, composed and commanding, extending the hand of engagement to a president representing the very nation once deemed China's greatest adversary. The negotiations that followed were equally intricate. Discussions ranged from trade and cultural exchanges to strategic cooperation and the delicate issue of Taiwan. Mao's approach was methodical and uncompromising, reflecting his belief that China's sovereignty and security could never be sacrificed. Yet he recognized the benefits of engagement, economic opportunities, access to Western technology, and the ability to recalibrate China's global position without resorting to military confrontation. For Nixon, the visit offered the chance to exploit the Sino-Soviet rift, open new diplomatic channels, and secure a broader geopolitical advantage. Both sides understood that the optics were as critical as the substance. Every handshake, photograph, and public statement was part of a carefully constructed narrative of dent. Behind the scenes, Mao's domestic imperatives remained paramount. While projecting strength internationally, he continued to consolidate control at home. The Cultural Revolution, the winding down, had left deep scars on Chinese society and governance. Mao balanced these internal challenges with his foreign policy ambitions, recognizing that domestic stability was essential to sustaining international credibility. He cultivated loyalty within the party, reinforced ideological education, and ensured that the narrative of China's rising global influence was inseparable from his leadership. The rapprochement with the United States had profound implications beyond the bilateral relationship. It signaled to the world that China was no longer isolated, that it could engage pragmatically without compromising core principles. It reshaped alliances, forcing the Soviet Union to reconsider its approach and signaling to other nations that China could act decisively and independently. The opening of diplomatic channels allowed China to participate in international institutions, trade negotiations, and multilateral discussions, enhancing its visibility and influence on the world stage. Mao's strategic vision extended beyond mere diplomacy. It was an exercise in perception management, leverage, and long-term positioning. He recognized that the Cold War was not a static conflict of armies and ideologies. It was a fluid contest of influence, credibility, and narrative control. By orchestrating the ping-pong diplomacy and the Nixon visit, Mao achieved multiple objectives simultaneously, strengthening China's global standing, undermining Soviet influence, securing a cautious engagement with the United States, and consolidating his domestic authority. The consequences of these actions reverberated for decades. China emerged as a key player in the global Cold War, no longer confined to regional conflicts in Korea or Vietnam. Its engagement with the United States marked the beginning of a new era in which diplomacy, strategic calculation, and soft power complemented military strength. The careful orchestration of events from a table tennis match in Nagoya to the historic handshake in Beijing illustrated Mao's understanding that leadership in the modern world required more than ideology. It demanded vision, patience, and an acute sense of timing. By the mid-1970s, China had transformed its position from an embattled revolutionary state to an influential actor capable of shaping outcomes on the international stage. The Cold War was entering a new phase, one in which Beijing would play a decisive, independent role. Mao's strategies, honed through decades of warfare, revolution, and political consolidation, were now expressed through diplomacy, negotiation, and controlled engagement with the United States. The lessons of Korea and Vietnam, combined with the subtleties of symbolic diplomacy, had prepared China for a world in which power was measured not only by armies, but by influence, perception, and strategic foresight. Mao's careful orchestration of these events ensured that China's voice would be heard, respected, and feared. The rapprochement with the United States was more than a historic meeting. It was the culmination of decades of strategy, ambition, and vision. Mao had transformed China's Cold War posture, demonstrating that ideological commitment could coexist with pragmatic engagement, and that a nation once seen as insular and reactive could now shape the course of global affairs. As the 1970s progressed, China's emerging role would continue to redefine the contours of the Cold War. Its interactions with the United States would influence policy decisions in Southeast Asia, the Soviet Union, and beyond. Mao's vision of a China capable of asserting itself on the global stage was realized not through conquest alone, but through the careful interplay of diplomacy, strategic calculation, and the management of perception. The dragon had opened its door, and the world would never be the same. The dragon ascendant China's late Cold War maneuvers. By the mid-1970s, Mao Zedong's China had emerged from decades of internal upheaval and regional conflict into a period of cautious international engagement. The successes of the early 1970s, particularly the breakthrough in relations with the United States, demonstrated China's ability to leverage diplomacy and strategic calculation as effectively as it had once wielded armies. Yet the late Mao era was defined not merely by triumphs. It was a time of relentless maneuvering, complex global positioning, and the careful balancing of ideology, power, and pragmatism. Internally, China remained a nation in transition. The Cultural Revolution had left its marks on governance, society, and military structures. Mao's political authority, though unchallenged, required constant reinforcement through symbolic acts, campaigns, and the cultivation of loyalty. Propaganda, education, and public displays of unity became essential tools in consolidating power. The narrative of China's rise and survival was inseparable from Mao's personal legitimacy. He had become both the embodiment of revolutionary success and the guarantor of national security. Every international move reinforced this domestic imperative. The global stage was no longer defined solely by a Soviet rivalry. China had begun to assert itself as an independent axis of power. Beijing's strategy involved nuanced engagement with multiple actors, cultivating relationships with Washington while remaining wary of American influence, managing the ideological and strategic rift with Moscow, and supporting revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America selectively to enhance China's influence without overcommitting resources. This intricate balancing act required both subtlety and resolve. Vietnam remained a critical focus. Though China had withdrawn its direct combat forces after the war, the relationship with Hanoi was complex and often tense. Beijing supported North Vietnam with military advisors, engineers, and logistical aid, yet Mao was cautious not to entangle China too deeply in another protracted conflict. The lessons of Korea were fresh. Overextension could endanger both domestic stability and strategic leverage. The Sino-Vietnamese relationship oscillated between solidarity and friction, as Mao sought to maintain influence while preventing Hanoi from drifting too far toward Moscow's orbit. Mao's approach to global revolutionary movements reflected this dual strategy. China provided ideological support and selective material assistance to insurgencies, emphasizing independence from Soviet guidance. Beijing sought to present itself as the true champion of revolutionary principles, offering an alternative to Moscow's perceived dogmatism. This strategy was evident in Africa, where China supported liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, balancing ideological commitment with careful diplomacy to avoid provoking direct confrontation with the United States or the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, China expanded its engagement with international institutions and global forums. Participation in the United Nations, trade negotiations, and multilateral discussions allowed Beijing to project influence without direct military involvement. Mao recognized that power in the modern world required legitimacy, visibility, and the ability to shape narratives. By positioning China as a responsible and assertive actor on the world stage, he sought to secure both security and respect. The late 1970s also saw a focus on military modernization. Mao understood that China's ability to maneuver in the Cold War depended not only on diplomacy, but also on credible deterrence. Investment in the People's Liberation Army, strategic missile programs, and coastal defenses ensured that China could defend its interests while signaling strength to both allies and adversaries. This approach reflected Mao's enduring belief in the interplay of political and military strategy. Victory required control over perception as much as control over territory. Mao's final years were marked by both consolidation and introspection. While projecting strength abroad, he remained acutely aware of internal vulnerabilities. Factionalism within the Communist Party, economic challenges, and the lingering effects of the Cultural Revolution required careful management. Mao balanced ideological campaigns with pragmatic governance, recognizing that China's survival and ascent depended on both domestic stability and global positioning. One of the most consequential aspects of this era was the refinement of China's Cold War posture. Mao understood that direct confrontation with the United States was neither necessary nor desirable. Instead, he leveraged diplomacy, strategic alliances, and the careful use of revolutionary support to expand China's influence. The United States, recognizing Beijing's strategic independence, gradually accepted China as a counterweight to Soviet power, formalizing relations and creating space for pragmatic engagement. Mao's vision of a China capable of shaping global outcomes without succumbing to foreign dominance had begun to materialize. In East Asia, China's presence remained decisive. The Korean peninsula, though still tense, had stabilized under the armistice, and China maintained a watchful eye on developments. Vietnam, though allied, increasingly followed its own path, necessitating a recalibration of China's approach. Mao's advisors emphasized flexibility, contingency planning, and the careful cultivation of influence through both direct support and diplomatic channels. Beijing's actions were deliberate, every move calculated to maximize leverage while minimizing risk. China's engagement extended beyond Asia. Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East became theaters for subtle influence campaigns, aid programs, and ideological outreach. Beijing emphasized solidarity with anti-imperialist movements while avoiding entanglement in conflicts that could overextend its resources. These efforts reinforced the image of China as a global actor, independent of both Washington and Moscow, capable of shaping outcomes through strategy, influence, and selective intervention. By the time of Mao's death in 1976, China had transformed its position from a revolutionary, embattled state into a nation recognized for both strategic acumen and emerging global influence. Mao's legacy was complex. Domestically, he had maintained control through campaigns, ideology, and personal authority. Internationally, he had leveraged diplomacy, limited conflict, and calculated engagement to establish China as a credible player in the Cold War. The People's Republic was no longer simply a regional actor, it had become a central force in global geopolitics. The late Mao era demonstrated the synthesis of ideology and pragmatism. China's rise was not predicated solely on military might or revolutionary zeal. It relied on a nuanced understanding of global power dynamics, the careful management of alliances, and the strategic timing of engagement. Mao's policies ensured that China could assert influence, deter threats, and navigate the complexities of a bipolar world without compromising sovereignty. As the Cold War continued into the 1980s, China's foundation, laid during Mao's leadership, enabled subsequent leaders to pursue modernization, economic reform, and expanded international engagement. The strategies honed during the late Mao era balancing diplomacy, military readiness, and ideological positioning remained central to China's approach to global affairs. The dragon had not only opened its door, but had planted itself firmly within the corridors of power, ready to navigate the shifting tides of the international order. In conclusion, the late Mao period was a masterclass in strategic patience, global positioning, and calculated influence. China's Cold War maneuvers reflected a profound understanding of both regional and global dynamics. By the time Mao passed from the scene, he had ensured that China was no longer isolated, vulnerable, or reactive. Instead, it had become an assertive, independent actor, capable of shaping outcomes, asserting its interests, and commanding respect on the world stage. The legacy of this era would define China's trajectory for decades to come, transforming it from a revolutionary power into a global player in the enduring struggle of Cold War geopolitics. Shadows and Dragons, the legacy of Mao's Cold War. As the final echoes of the Cold War reverberated across continents, the world had been reshaped by ideologies, armies, and the calculated diplomacy of men like Mao Zedong. From the frostbitten battlefields of Korea to the tense ping-pong tables of Nagoya, every maneuver, every strategic decision, and every diplomatic overture had carved China's path from isolation to global prominence. The decades-long confrontation with the United States and the careful balancing of power between Washington and Moscow had transformed a revolutionary nation into a player capable of shaping history itself. Mao's vision had been at once ideological and pragmatic. He saw China not merely as a participant in global conflict, but as a rising force with the potential to redefine the rules of engagement. The Korean War, with its staggering human cost and dramatic triumphs, had taught lessons in both military strategy and psychological warfare. China's willingness to risk armies to protect perceived sovereignty demonstrated that ideology alone could be a weapon, but only when paired with meticulous planning, discipline, and national unity. The ripple effects of the Korean conflict were immense. Mao had consolidated authority at home, transforming the Communist Party from a fragile revolutionary movement into a commanding force with legitimacy across China's vast territories. The Cultural Revolution, the purges, the campaigns all were part of a broader narrative, one that justified sacrifice for the vision of a strong, unassailable China. By projecting power externally and maintaining tight internal control, Mao had created a blueprint for leadership that combined fear, reverence, and inspiration, a model that would guide China long after his passing. Diplomacy, too, became a battlefield. The ping-pong diplomacy of the early 1970s was far more than a friendly exchange between athletes. It was a carefully orchestrated signal to the world that China had arrived as a force to be reckoned with. Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972 marked not just a thaw in Sino-American relations, but an affirmation of China's strategic acumen. Mao had proven that even a nation battered by war, revolution, and upheaval could command attention and respect on the global stage. Every handshake, every shared smile, was a deliberate stroke in the broader canvas of Cold War politics. Yet Mao's China remained complex, unpredictable, and fiercely independent. While the world perceived the United States and the Soviet Union as the primary poles of the Cold War, Mao had demonstrated that China could maneuver between them, exploiting divisions, fostering selective alliances, and asserting influence without fully committing to either side. Vietnam, Africa, and other theaters of ideological struggle became instruments of strategic positioning rather than zones for full-scale occupation. China's engagement was always calculated, every move designed to expand influence while avoiding unnecessary exposure. By the time of Mao's death in 1976, China had transformed from a beleaguered revolutionary state into a formidable geopolitical actor. Its Cold War legacy was not written solely in military campaigns or ideological proclamations. It was etched in the careful orchestration of diplomacy, the projection of power, and the cultivation of a national identity resilient enough to endure decades of external pressure and internal upheaval. Mao's strategies had reshaped the world's perception of China not just as a country to be wary of, but as a power capable of independent thought, strategic foresight, and decisive action. The Cold War itself began to shift. While the superpowers continued their ideological and nuclear standoff, China's emergence as a third actor complicated every calculation. No longer could the United States or the Soviet Union assume that their actions alone would shape Asia or the wider globe. Beijing had entered the equation, a silent dragon whose moves were deliberate, unpredictable, and increasingly influential. The Cold War was no longer a two-player game, it was a triad, with China asserting its interests, defending its sovereignty, and challenging the assumptions of both Washington and Moscow. Mao's death did not end the era he had shaped. Instead, it passed the torch to successors who inherited both the burdens and the strategies of his reign. The foundation laid during the Cold War, the combination of ideological conviction, military readiness, and diplomatic ingenuity allowed China to embark on a path of modernization, economic reform, and global engagement. The lessons of Korea, Vietnam, and the opening to the United States became guiding principles for the next generation of Chinese leaders. Looking back, Mao's Cold War was more than a regional struggle or a battle of ideologies. It was a transformative epic in which China defined itself against external powers while forging its internal identity. Every decision, every risk, and every calculated move reflected a deep understanding of history, power, and human nature. From the frozen rivers of Yalu to the polished halls of Beijing's embassies, Mao's China had shown that strategy, patience, and audacity could elevate a nation from the shadows of war to the forefront of global affairs. And as the 20th century drew to a close, the world had learned an enduring lesson. The legacy of a single leader, when intertwined with the fate of a nation, can ripple across decades, shaping alliances, conflicts, and the very structure of international power. Mao's Cold War was not merely a struggle against the United States, nor simply an ideological battle. It was the story of China's ascent, a story of vision, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of national sovereignty and global influence. In the end, the Cold War left behind a world forever changed, and China emerged not as a passive observer, but as a calculated, formidable, and enduring force. A dragon awakened, its shadows stretching across continents, its roar echoing through history, a testament to the audacity and strategy of Mao Zedong.